Hello all, and welcome back to Camber. Today is going to be a little bit of a different video, a little bit more impromptu. This is just going to be a very general dive into abiogenesis, which, for those of you who are unaware, is basically the study of how life came about on Earth. Why I say it's impromptu is I really wanted to take more time to actually know my stuff and give a more deep dive into what's going on here. But I recently saw such an aggressively rage bait video on TikTok where I felt like I had to respond to it in some sense, and I'd feel bad mouthing off to my family or friends about a topic they probably don't know or don't care about. So instead, I'm just going to dump my thoughts onto the internet, as well as maybe give some criticisms of science communication as I see it today and some of the issues I see with this video that I came upon just a couple days ago. So this is going to be just, I guess, an example of some bad science communication. So before I delve into any of the, I guess, my criticisms, we have to first see this video, so let's just do that right now.
The vast majority of people in this country believe that scientists have made life. We're not even close. This is a real deception. In fact, I used to say that origin of life research is a scam, and I was quoting Lee Cronin, an origin of life researcher. And he's asked me not to quote him on that anymore, so I don't. But that is the state of the field. It's a scam, and money is being spent on it, and the population is deceived on this, terribly deceived. And I think if a field is projecting something that is so far from reality that it needs to be called out. And it hurts the field, because my argument is this, that if we don't tell students the real state of the field, and they believe what this says, that you figured this out. Scientists think that they finally figured it out. Most don't go this far. Some say that they're very close, they will say. I mean, this guy said it. They figured it out. Because why would people want to go into this to solve this thing, which is a big question, if they're told that it's been solved?
So before we actually delve into the substance of anything that this professor said, I'm going to share with you a little bit of the backstory of who this professor is and clue you into some of the juiciest academia lore that I'm aware of. So first off, the person that you see speaking in the video that I played you is Dr. James Torr. He's a professor at Rice University, and to give him the only credit that he deserves, he's honestly a pretty good researcher, but he mainly only studies the field of synthetic organic chemistry. He has many publications, and from the surface level, he seems like a very knowledgeable dude. But then this is where we get into the juicy lore of what has been going on for the past couple years and why I got so upset that this guy showed up on my TikTok For You page right before I wanted to go to bed. Because quite frankly, I was feeling really relaxed and I saw this video pop up on my feed and I had a panic attack because it was just quite frankly so astounding the things that he proudly projects out onto other people. So, further background, Dr. James Torr is part of the Discovery Institute, which, just generally speaking, their main goal in the Discovery Institute is to wear down the separation of church and state and try to get Christianity to be taught in public schools, which I'll just say this on top here. If you are religious, power to you. And that's one of the beautiful things about America is that everybody has the freedom to practice whatever religion they like. However, my issue comes when you start pushing your religion onto other people in areas such as public education, which should be nonpartisan and non-biased, and that is definitely not what Discovery Institute or James Torr wants. This is, and I guess the main way that James Tour fell into the space of origin of life research is not as a researcher himself. He hasn't published any research in the field himself. I think he recently uploaded a video talking about he published finally in a peer-reviewed journal about origin of life research, which I haven't looked at, but I'd highly doubt that there's anything of substance in the paper he published. He's mainly a synthetic organic chemist, but he came on many years ago into the field, and or not into the field, onto YouTube, and put some criticisms onto the field, which basically amounted to, I'm an organic chemist, I know how to synthesize stuff really well, let me show you some of the complicated molecules that arise in life today and show you how hard it would be to synthesize them. Which, for those of you who are unaware, current estimates project that life started roughly 4 billion to the earliest estimates being 4.5 billion years ago. So he's taking a molecule which took 4 to 4.5 billion years for life to produce itself and says, yeah, it'd be impossible to make this just spontaneously, which it would, because it took 4 billion years of evolution to get to a point where that molecule could be made by life. And he got basically eviscerated by somebody called Professor Dave Explains, who personally I think is a wonderful science communicator. And if you want to learn more in depth than I'm going to go in this video, I'd highly recommend his series talking about James Tour and all of the criticisms that Dr. Tour raises against the field. Just to briefly summarize his series and put a lot more nicely than Professor Dave explains, um, the main, I guess, argument Professor Dave has against James Tour is that none of his, I guess, critiques of the field are actual critiques and are more gotcha moments which try to seed doubt in people's mind who don't understand biochemistry. And he's basically just trying to set himself up in a position of saying, none of this research is really interesting, and I don't think we'll get a real answer. So that must mean that all of us were created and that we are all part of God's creation, which you can believe that if you want. But if you want to actually go into the science of it and dismiss it for bogus claims, and then just claim victory and say that we were created because you don't want to interact with any of the actual material itself, then I can see why Professor Dave was so, I guess, mad and had to, in excruciatingly detail, explain how James Tour doesn't actually care about these academic arguments and instead wants to support his message of faith basically blindly without even wanting to cooperate with these researchers and just making hit pieces on origin of life researchers without any real substance. And one of the big, I guess, ideas that James Tour uses to talk about how silly it would be for life to form naturally is to say, if we know how life started that many billion years ago, then you should make life right now de novo, which is a pretty silly argument. And it's hard for somebody who isn't in the field to see how that's such, um, like, it's a non starter. It's not even a claim worth addressing, since you categorically misunderstand the question of trying to understand what happened when life started by saying, make a human cell out of thin air. Let me give you an analogy of this. Basically, what James Tour is saying is, if you understand biology and how biology started so well, then how about you create it for me, but I want it from scratch. So let's imagine, instead of talking about something living, let's talk about a mechanic, a car mechanic. And you tell this mechanic, oh, so you think you understand cars very well? How about you build me a car? Which a really good mechanic who knows their stuff probably could build a car from scratch. But then James Tour goes ahead and says, but actually, you can't buy anything from any manufacturer. You need to make all your own parts. You need to forge your own engine block and all of this. And if you can't do it, you don't understand how a car works. It's a very disingenuous argument saying that we need to make a cell that would be representative of life today because we have 4 billion years to create cellular machinery, which allows for life to create itself. It was a really disingenuous argument. You can even see this being parroted by some of the people in James Torr's comments, which I don't want to sound petty or anything, but I was in his comments obviously very upset because I've already seen years of him being, I guess, exposed by Professor Dave Explains as merely a clown who is basically putting on a charade of understanding what's happening in the field when in reality it's been shown that origin of life researchers don't even want to interact with James Tour because there's nothing of substance to interact with. He doesn't give them any, I guess, next steps for future experiments they want to do. He categorically doesn't understand their research. But and that's basically just the reason why I was so upset to see him pop up on my For You page on TikTok. I thought that the algorithm would be better than that to know that I don't want somebody who doesn't want what's best for science and then they project this content onto me. But anyway, I wrote a comment basically trying to alert people saying, he's already been thoroughly exposed by Professor Dave Explains, which by the way, I I think I mentioned this already. I think he's a very good science communicator, and he has many origin of life researchers that feature in his series exposing James Tour, where they have a chance to talk about some of their research. So if you are interested, I'd highly recommending checking out his series. But looking at some of the other comments that are in this comment section, you can see it's basically just a bunch of religious people patting themselves on the back saying, I'm glad I'm as smart as a guy with a PhD. But there was one comment that stood out to me, which I thought was really funny, and I'll just read it to you here. This guy says, I have a degree in biochemistry and over 30 years professional experience. We hardly know anything. The pride and arrogance is absurd. We can't duplicate what a single chloroplast can do. We can't even estimate the log of reactions and feedback mechanisms that occur for a single leaf to be formed. We manipulate processes as life is forming and think ourselves gods. Total pride and lacking of required humility needed to learn and advance. Which, just to address this comment here, which I think he falls into the same pitfall that Dr. Tor does, is that when he mentions we can't even replicate what a chloroplast does, well, as I mentioned, life started roughly 4 billion years ago. Let's just say that it's 4 billion years. It might even be earlier. But chloroplasts are thought to have originated roughly 2 billion to the very earliest being 2.7 billion years ago. So, from the very start of where we think life began, there was a billion years of stuff which led to the formation of the chloroplast. So, we aren't even talking about the earliest of early what life could look like. And he's saying we want to replicate a chloroplast, which obviously we know isn't the very first thing that life came up with. This was something that took a billion years at least to come up with for life to be able to harness the sun's energy. Something that's even funnier is that he talks about we don't understand the mechanisms for making a leaf form, which is even more hilarious because yes, leaves have chloroplasts, but plants, surprisingly, you probably wouldn't. I guess this is one of the things that surprised me. Plants are relatively recent in the whole like cosmic scale of time. Plants came about roughly 630 to 500 million years ago. So it's even a worse argument saying that we can't replicate a leaf because evolution had basically 3 billion years of time that were just set in motion 4 billion years ago and just kept on complexifying. And over 3 billion years, we got to a leaf. And this guy is saying, let's just skip the 3 billion years of where we know where the first initial life started and how that looked like. Forget about that. I want you to make something that is very recent and very complex. And it just doesn't make sense. And it makes me wonder if he's even being truthful about his credentials here, because I feel like anybody with just a smidge of background in this field would understand how disingenuous this comment is. But this is the only comment. Everybody else just being other people from all different kinds of religion just being happy that they have some sort of crusader who says that they are correct. And this is another good time to bring up the point that just because somebody has good credentials doesn't mean you should listen to everything they say and their expertise. a good example from a book that I read recently is that Dr. Linus Pauling, who won Nobel Prize in chemistry as well as a Nobel Peace Prize, very, very smart man, but then later on in his life turned out to be somewhat of a crackpot, believing that taking just supplementing with vitamin C would stop common colds, kill cancers, and was basically like a miracle drug, which there is some nuance to it, but there is some reason to believe that high amounts of vitamin C could potentially kill some cancers. But for the most part, this is a really smart dude who progressed the field of chemistry so much, and even then, his credentials make it so that some people would think that having a PhD and this guy is saying take a lot of vitamin C, and then people just start taking vitamin C. So take everything from researchers with a grain of salt, even from me, because I only have 4 years of biochemistry experience as opposed to this dude's supposed 30 years of experience. But what I'd tell you is that credentials aren't everything, and that is one of the main thing that the Discovery Institute is trying to, I guess, force onto people, is they have a bunch of people with doctorates who are in their program trying to say, we're all qualified, we all know what we're doing, you have to be smart to get a doctorate, which you really don't. You just have to be determined and willing to like sit there and have experiments fail for 5 years before something works and you contribute to knowledge that expands our, I guess, idea of anything in the realm of science, I guess. But what is it that actual life, first life, looked like? What we believe, or what the field believes, is the first origin of life is something called Luca, or the last universal common ancestor. Basically, what Luca is a protocell, basically meaning a very primitive membrane which encapsulates some stuff that's inside of it. There's some sort of a primitive metabolism there. And importantly, which is something that Dr. James Tour gets wrong a lot of the time, is that Luca would most definitely be filled with RNA and not DNA. DNA is something that took billions of years, and we can tell that like RNA, that originally life started using RNA, not DNA, because even today, every cell in your body that wants to make any DNA bases, it first makes RNA bases and then converts the RNA bases to DNA bases. And that isn't a perfect argument for saying that life originally started with RNA, but it's a pretty cool, I guess, relic of the fact that RNA almost certainly was the first, I guess, unit of heritability before we eventually switched to DNA at some point in time. And there's even ways in which we can track that we are almost certainly all, I guess, related in some sense, even to bacteria. And the way we know this is that there's some, like, on the molecular level it's a lot easier to see this, because obviously if you're just looking at like physiological differences and you're looking between a human and a bacteria, it's like, what could we possibly have in common? Well, the way we generate energy is almost basically identical. We only do it in one way, basically showing us that this happened one time, very long time ago, and everybody just went with that mechanism. There's also another really good book that I'd recommend, and it's this one here called Oxygen by Nick Lane. In this book, if you want to learn more about abiogenesis, I'd recommend Professor Dave Explains or this book. But essentially, what part of this book explains is that oxygen is a very highly reactive molecule, and there's reason to think that aging is caused because of the fact that we need oxygen and we use oxygen to, I guess, in our cycle of producing energy. And since oxygen is so reactive, it might react with stuff that we don't want it to, causing cellular slash molecular damage, and this leads to eventual aging. So cells have many mechanisms to try and prevent these reactive oxygen species, or loosely called free radicals. And there's these mechanisms to try and limit the amount of damage that oxygen can do to your cells. And these are enzymes, or basically protein machinery, that is very common across all forms of life, meaning that Luca almost certainly had this type of cellular machinery that would guard itself from free radicals, and is another reason yet to believe that we all have some sort of common descent from Luca, our last universal common ancestor. And this is enough, I guess, background. I'm going to start going into a little bit more substance of what Dr. Tor said. But the last thing I'd like to mention is that this field is highly interdisciplinary, and is one of the main reasons why James is not a good person to trust in this area, because he's really good at organic chemistry, which, sure, you need to understand some organic chemistry to understand what happened at the origin of life, but you also need to understand geology, astronomy, physics, biology, and chemistry as well, if not many other fields, to altogether paint a cohesive picture of what could have been happening billions of years ago on our planet. And that is also to say that I'm not an expert in this field either, and I kind of just enjoy from the sidelines. I find this stuff very interesting, but apart from the videos that I've seen online of Professor Dave Explains and some research articles I read, and one elective course that I took about a similar topic to this, I really don't have any experience in this field. And I'm really speaking from a place of somebody who admires the people who do this research. And I don't like it to see it when people bash them for their work, when I can so obviously see they don't understand, I guess, the methodology of the way we're going about trying to solve this problem of what happened many billion years ago. But now that we have all this out here, let's talk about some of the stuff that Dr. James Tor actually said in this video, why it upset me so much, and why it's a perfect example of bad science communication. So, the first thing that Dr. James Tor says is that everybody believes that we have already made life so far. And as I explained earlier, if we are to believe that we have made life de novo without using any currently available, I guess, cellular machinery that life currently uses, then I think it's a perfectly valid thing to say, and I might even agree with James on this point. But I guess the nuance here is that I would say I don't think it's necessary for us to make life de novo for us to understand how life happened. And for this, I'll give you another analogy as to what I mean by we don't need to actually make life for it to understand what could have happened. Imagine we're thinking about the question of how did life arrive from 4 billion years ago to how it is today. Instead of thinking of life arriving after 4 billion years, let's think about, you want to hang out with a friend and you ask them to come over, and then your friend comes over, they ring the doorbell, you open the door and you see they're there. And now the question I ask you is, how did your friend get to the door? Because your friend doesn't live in your house. He had to come from somewhere. How is it that he got there? Well, you can't see how he got there because you only saw him come at the door and he's there. So, what are some plausible explanations for how he got there? Knowing what we know about society, your first guess could be, well, maybe he took a plane over, or maybe he jumped out of a plane and skydived down to your house. That is a plausible explanation, not a very realistic one, but it's it could be a possible explanation how your friend got there. But with further evidence, you could say, well, it actually costs a lot of money to skydive out of a plane. Maybe he did something cheaper, like instead rent a helicopter. And then with further and further accumulating evidence, you could say, maybe it wouldn't be as, I guess, it wouldn't make sense for that to happen, knowing what I know about society today. Maybe he drove or walked walked, or biked to my place. And you'll never know because you just saw him show up at the door, but you eventually arrive closer and closer to what might have actually happened. And that's the whole point about origin of life research. We can never double check what happened because original life is so flimsy and it cannot be fossilized, so that we will never truly know what happened 4 billion years ago. But we can paint a very realistic picture of what could have happened by evaluating data and asking better questions and coming to a better understanding of what is the most likely scenario that could have happened. So just because we'll never be able to double check doesn't mean we won't have a good idea of what happened. And I think it's very facetious to say that we need to make life as it was 4 billion years ago and show how it could have exploded into all forms of life we see today, because as I said in this video already, it took 4 billion years for Luca to turn into everything we know and love today. So that's the only, I guess, real part that I could agree with James upon, is that I think it is a little bit much to say that we already know how life started. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, and there's still a lot of people actively working in the field. Because we haven't solved this question, we probably won't get a satisfactory answer for a very long time, because it's a very difficult question and requires many fields and many different insights for us to get a satisfactory answer. So let's look at the actual, I guess, article that Professor, or not Professor Dave, let's look at the article that James Tour shows at the very end of the video. So the article is titled, "How Did the First Cells Form on Earth? Scientists Think They've Finally Figured It Out." I think, similar to James Tour, this is another example of some really bad science communication. And let's just dive into the article a little further, and I'll tell you why I think this. First off, this was written by Eric Rawls, which Eric attended Vanderbilt, which, pretty prestigious university. I wouldn't dare say he didn't get a good education, but he majored in Japanese language and literature slash psychology, which isn't necessarily a problem, but you can see that he probably doesn't understand the field of origin of life. As I already said, it's a very interdisciplinary field, and none of those disciplines match that which Eric studies. So he almost certainly would have had to have this explained to him like a baby by a researcher who has many tens of years of experience in fields that Eric has no experience in. At least that's what I'm assuming. So you should have alarm bells going off that, Eric probably shouldn't be trusted in, I guess, as the messenger of this information. Because while he could have talked to some really smart people, then it's really up to Eric to, I guess, put it together in a coherent way to be reflective of what researchers actually believe happened. Which, in the case of the researchers he interviewed, these are researchers at Scripps Research Institute, which very reputable, very reliable. I wouldn't doubt that the research that these people cited in this article did is bad, but it definitely is certainly facetious. And let's just look at what they actually were studying, what these researchers at Scripps were studying, and why Eric think it means that we've finally figured it out. So before we delve into the research, just a tiny bit more background. There's four classes of macromolecules which create all of life as we know it, basically. We have carbohydrates, which are basically just sugars. We have nucleic acids, which make up DNA and RNA. We have proteins, which make up enzymes and all sorts of other molecular machinery. And then we have lipids, which make up the membranes, which guard all of the stuff inside a cell and keep all the stuff outside the cell outside. These are the four basic macromolecules that we know that life needs, that all life uses to perform the function that life does. In this research that the people from Scripps are doing, they're just looking at a prebiotically relevant way for lipids or fatty acids in another sense to be phosphorylated or to have a phosphate group attached to them. And what I mean by prebiotically relevant is that we want to know what type of chemistry would have been possible on an early Earth billions of years ago. And that's why you need to have geology and astronomy as well, because you need to be able to ask people, what was the atmosphere like and what type of chemistry would have been possible those many billions of years ago? And these guys think that they have found a prebiotically relevant method for synthesizing lipids with phosphate groups, which is very interesting because then these lipids with phosphate groups more closely resemble what we would think life of as today, which is having a polar head group and a non-polar tail, as opposed to what was previously known as a prebiotic, oh my god, as a prebiotically relevant lipid. So this is cool work, but it certainly doesn't warrant the title of saying scientists finally think they figured out how cells formed on the early Earth. Why is that? Because these researchers found a prebiotically relevant method for one of the four macromolecules. So in isolation, these researchers don't know anything about how life formed on Earth. They know one of four key steps, and that's only there's still so much more you'd need to show to prove that we know how early life formed on Earth. So the fact that Eric is claiming that these researchers have figured it out is facetious, and I'd agree with James here that this article is it's basically just slop, you know? Like the actual insides of the actual article itself, I'll give Eric his credit. I think he did a pretty okay job at summarizing what these researchers told him, but the title of the article certainly does not at all match the substance of the article that Eric wrote about. And this is just going to lead me to the two problems I see with scientific communication today, the two main ones. So I think the first one being is that we usually rely on journalists to give us these updates in the scientific field. And I see that as a problem mainly because it isn't really a problem that you have a journalist talking to a scientist, but ideally you'd want to have somebody who is both a journalist and a scientist. And that is why I think Professor Dave Explains is a pretty good example of a science communicator, because not only does he know his stuff, he has a pretty rigorous background in chemistry, but he's also good at simplifying these subjects in a way that most scientists cannot. Most scientists are jargon heavy, they like to show how much they know, and they can't meet people at their level of not having all this prerequisite knowledge and just immediately confuse people and make people think they're dumb and not want to interact with all of the cool stuff that we are doing. So you need a happy medium, which is also, like I said again, Nick Lane. This book I think is also pretty approachable. It maybe is a little dense for people who don't know anything about chemistry, but I certainly enjoyed it a whole lot. Um, but that's one of the main issues I see with science communication today is not necessarily that it's bad to have journalists who don't know science talking to scientists, but it's that it's very easy for these journalists to misrepresent the scientists' findings because they're trying to write stuff in a way to sell stuff instead of actually make people interested in the field. And that goes on to my second, I guess, concern with science communication today is that this is less about, I guess, scientific communication, more of a systemic journalism problem, is that I don't think real journalism exists anymore today. And what I mean by that is that instead of trying to give substantive work out, we're now in the era of just producing slop and trying to capture people's attention to the point where I'd be surprised if anybody who clicked on Eric's article actually read any of it. They probably, like James Torr said, looked at the article, like the title of it, said, "Oh, we've made life. That's cool," and then they didn't actually go into any of the nitty gritty details. And this actually does a lot of harm to the scientific community because you're trying to make scientists look like these wishy-washy, they don't know what they think. You have people that are reporting on quantum physics saying that we can already time travel, we've found ways to like make invisibility cloaks and all of this garbage, which if you look into the actual article itself, you can see why they maybe would have named this article that, but it gives off the illusion that scientists are just stupid idiots who say stuff that is unfounded, when in reality it's these journalists who are coming up with these clickbait articles because they at the end of the day want to sell their stuff, which, I get it, everybody has to make a living somehow, but it certainly throws a lot of shade on the scientific community in a time where science is already under attack. So, other than these main issues I have with science communication today, I'm just going to tie up some other loose ends with some of the stuff that James Torr said in this video. At one point, he mentioned that even a researcher in the field of origin of life research said that his own research is a scam. And let's get it from the horse's mouth, because this origin of life researcher certainly did say that his own research is a scam. So let's look at where he said this. This was said on Twitter, which I think, as you guys know, if you say something on Twitter, is not meant to be a place where you share academic information and is more of a place for just lighthearted fun. And this professor, Lee Cronin, eventually appeared on some other podcast, and he was asked about this tweet where he said it was tongue in cheek. I was joking. I didn't think that anybody would take me seriously. But then Dr. James Torr took it as this is truth. He definitely meant it, that his own research is stupid, even though Lee Cronin, like James Torr, is basically asking for money from the government to do this research, and then you think he's actively saying his own research is a scam. Do you think that Lee Cronin is an idiot? Which, by the way, Lee Cronin is maybe, I wouldn't say one of my favorite scientists of all time, but he definitely has some very intriguing ideas. And this is what I meant. This was an impromptu video. I wanted to talk about something that Lee Cronin and others have started talking about called assembly theory. And this is a video that I want to make in the future, but it is very dense and a little bit more above my pay grade. So I want to take my time to actually understand what's going on there before I share it on the internet. But I I just say that Lee Cronin is an amazing researcher, certainly much better than Dr. James Torr. And the fact that Dr. James Torr is using this as evidence that the field of origin of life research is a scam is humorous and shows even more that he's a disingenuous person who is trying to push the agenda of far right Christian nationalists who want to make sure that everybody gets taught Christianity in public schools. Something that I already kind of mentioned is that Dr. James Torr is claiming that students already think that the field is solved and the researchers are the ones that are saying that the field is solved, which it's funny because the source that he used to say that researchers are saying the field is solved is Eric Rawls, a person who doesn't have any connection to the field at all, somebody who doesn't understand the intricacies of it and made a clickbait title. He's claiming that this clickbait title from someone who isn't a researcher is driving students away from the academic research field, which I just find laughable. And last but certainly not least, I think probably the most aggravating and what makes my blood boil the most is James Torr saying that why would any students, I'm paraphrasing here, why would any students want to go into a field if it's already figured out? Not even to like bring up, I guess, because even 100 years ago, before, like, we thought that we already had figured out physics when we figured out when we figured out relativity, everybody was like, oh, I guess our work here is done. We've already mastered what Newton already first set out to, I guess, be able to classify, but now we have a better understanding. This is certainly all that we'll ever need, and there isn't anything more to discover. And then suddenly we have quantum mechanics. And even in the last 100 years, neuroscience, immunology, so many other fields which wouldn't have existed previous to 100 years are now still in their infancy, and we still have no idea about many parts and aspects of neuroscience or immunology. So the idea that we've already figured out science, or at least the origin of life research, is just so laughable. Because if there's one thing that is almost certain, is if you want to go into a field where you know there's going to be more questions to ask, science is the perfect field to go into, because I don't think there's ever going to be a time where we run out of stuff to investigate. And I'd say this is even more laughable coming from a guy who's a far right Christian nationalist saying students won't want to go into the field because it's already figured out. I think the reason students won't want to go into the field is because when you support people such as the administration, who shall not be named, who's currently gutting research funding in the United States, I think that is a much better reason for why people do not want to go into the field. They're being pushed out of a field which was thriving and want, like, the scientific industry, or the, I guess, the science complex in the United States was one of the best, and it's so far crumbling under this current administration. And I think it's laughable to think that that not being the reason for students not going into the field, and instead is because it's already figured out. I think this just points even further to the fact that you can't trust all people with PhDs, and I'd certainly be wary to trust anything coming out of James Tour's mouth. And yet again, if you want to learn more about abiogenesis, I'm not the best person. This is a good start. Nick Lane, Oxygen, wonderful book. I'm still currently reading through it, but I'd also check out Professor Dave Explains. Nick Lane and Professor Dave Explains, wonderful science communicators, in my opinion. I hope you've enjoyed me losing my mind at this example of what I surmise to say is a pretty horrific example of bad scientific communication. I hope that it wasn't visible how much my blood pressure rose filming this video. Um, but yeah, I hope that this, I guess, like dipping your toes just into the field of abiogenesis was interesting for some of you guys. And stay tuned because I'll likely talk about this field more in upcoming videos. But as always, I hope you guys have enjoyed and have a good one.